How's it going, YouTube? Coming to you today with another video, and today, guys, the video is going to be where to hand trap post Dune. I'm very excited to make this video today because there's so many different ways you can hand trap the different variants of the decks we're seeing next format. You'll see a lot of very interesting decks like Unchained Labrynth. So without further ado, let's hop right on into this because I really want to talk about all the different ways you can go about each and every variant. So if you haven't already checked out my sponsors over at Imperium to Dragon Shield, Gem, or my brand new sponsor Grimoire, definitely go ahead and do so all down in the description below. Without further ado, let's hop right in. So the first one I want to talk about today is going to be Tearlament. Now, you did see the Blackwing cards, the synchros, on my teaser, but this is because there's actually a variant of Tearlament that does include these. There's actually multiple variants of Tearlament right now. If you're playing against like the pure variant, definitely go ahead and Bishul Crow the Denier in the graveyard. I think that's going to be the best one. But if you're playing against like any kind of generic build that you're not really sure, you can always go ahead and just use Crow on any of the names in the graveyard so they can't fuse. Or just Ash Shiren specifically. Like, I'm never just going to Ash Purrely. I'm always just going to wait for Shiren because this card just does way too much, especially if they already opened up like Kelbeck or Agito. That's just like one of the scariest things that can happen. So definitely go after Denier if it's more of a pure build, but if you do see more of like a generic, you're not really sure what's going on build yet, I would definitely say go ahead and hit the names in the graveyard. It's probably your best bet. If you play against the Winda build where they're playing like the Op Cologne and the Schism, just wait and use Bell on Schism. Make sure that you're asking your opponent when they flip up Schism if they're using the effect on the flip or if they're waiting and they're using it later, because that's a big deal. If they flip it up and go effect on the flip, then you Bell, Schism goes to grave. If they wait and then use the effect afterward, then you can Bell and it'll stay. But that matters if you have Ogre, because then you can Ogre and send it to the graveyard. So definitely a huge disparity in the two, so make sure you're asking clarification. Now, with the Blackwing Synchros, you definitely want to go ahead and make sure that you're imperming Veiler, Mourner, whatever you have on either of these. I think that the one on the right here is definitely really impactful to hit because it can get to things like Zephyros or some of the other 6 that it banishes to get them another one. Or just hitting this one in general because it's another mill 5. But typically they're not getting to this without this first. So definitely something to think about. I definitely would just go ahead and hit this one first. But whichever one I see, I'm probably going to go after it with the hand trap that I have. So just kind of keep that in mind. And be careful with the ever-changing game state just because you never really know what route your opponent's going for. Sometimes they do get enough gas where they can summon this first. But if they go for this, I'm probably just going to go ahead and negate this first just so they can't get to this, right? If we're talking about Speedroid, this is actually really funny. I think I got the most comments from the teaser because everyone's like, why is Marble Machine on your where to hand trap? So I actually played against this deck at Nationals and I won. And afterward, I was talking with like a group of people and they're like, you play against Speedroid? I was like, yeah, I won. And they're like, well, did you know what to do? And I was like, I did, honestly. Like, I played against this deck a lot before. Shout out to my Discord. You know, I played against this a few times. And I thought it was really funny because they were like, well, we don't know how to hand trap that deck. What if we play against it? You need to include it in your next video. So here it is. It was actually really funny. Shout outs to my opponent on Speedroid Cash. I did not know it was Speedroid Cash until game 2. Because game 1, I had such a commanding board. And then game 2, my opponent was like, anyway, summon Fenrir, and then Birth, summon Unicorn. It was wild. Put up a huge board, and then I won in game 3. So definitely caught me off guard. But I did know how to hand trap this deck, so I want to share that with you as well. You can go ahead and Crow the target of speed recovery or Bell speed recovery. You really don't want your opponent to be able to get to more extenders. Ashing the Speedroid wheel or just the Marble Machine. This card's Skullcrobat Joker on summon, so it's really solid to go ahead and just Ash this, shut them off from any kind of resources they want. But definitely Mourner, Veiler, Imperm. It's the same thing against like Blackwing with the Y-Strix, Link 2. You really want to go ahead and shut this off as soon as possible. So just negate this, and usually you're in the clear. If you only have one, I'm just waiting for this. If you have like multiple hand traps, hit like the Marble and the Rubber Band. If you have like Bell and a effect negation, you're probably fine. But it's usually always just the Link 2. So the next thing here is Rescue Ace. Now, this is actually going to be pretty simple, but there's also a couple different ways that you really want to make sure that you're going about this the right way. The objective of the deck is just to protect Turbulence, and I think that's something that you really have to account for. So you probably are really confused by seeing Proxy F Magician over here, but what the builds are trying to do right now is summon Proxy F, use 2 of their monsters away, make Mud Dragon, call Fire, so you can't negate the Turbulence. So you really want to make sure if you have like 2 effect negations that you're aware your opponent could summon Proxy F, summon Mud, and then summon Turbulence, which then gets them a set 4. So maybe if you have 2 effect negations, you want to save one for like a proxy F, just in case they do go for that route. But you always want to just go ahead and negate Turbulence. This is the card that sets 4 from the deck. Make sure that you're on top of this. If your opponent has Emergency, they can go ahead and dodge this, but that's why you want to hold Ash for Emergency. That's going to be really important. You always want to Ash Emergency. This sets from the deck, so you can't Ash this, but you definitely want to make sure you have more Veiler or Imperm against the Turbulence. Usually that'll be a GG for you, but there's definitely a lot of ways that they're trying to go ahead and protect their Turbulence. So just kind of keep that in mind when you go about hand trapping the deck, that they do have the other ways to protect it, that they're going to. But if you only have one hand trap, the only spot I'm going to go for is Turbulence. I'm going to try my best to just negate that one card. So next up is Purrely. Now, we did just get the other rank 2, but nothing really changed. Like, even with the new rank 2, I don't think that the hand trap spots become any different. I think that it's always just correct to go ahead and Ash my friend Purrely, but if they summon Lily from one of their spells, then you can go ahead and just Mourner it, but otherwise, they just normal it. Or they have a way to summon it in other means, then go ahead and just Veiler or Imperm the Purrely is still just the best spot. These 2 cards are the hardest choke points of the deck. I still think this deck really isn't even that good with the new rank 2. I think the rank 2 is like cool, but Purrely still has the same problem where like if you break the board and you put up lethal, a lot of times they just can't stop you from lethaling. And that's going to be a really big problem in this deck moving forward. And I really don't think that Purrely can ever be the best deck. It has like the whole branded problem where like when branded's like the best deck, it can't be because then everyone just hard focuses on branded. And it's kind of the same thing as this, like Kurakara, Kaiju's, Herald of the Abyss, like so many cards can go in against this deck that just auto win. So I think that that's a huge problem for the deck moving forward, especially if you have like Kaiju plus like Duster or Lightning Storm or what have you, and Thrust is a 3 of, right? So that's one thing where if they draw in the standby phase, then you're already able to Thrust. So if you're able to blow out the My Friend, they don't get the cards back, and then you just win anyway. So there's a lot of reasons why I think this deck just isn't that good, but the hand trap spots don't change here. I think that it's still the same. So talking about the elephant in the room, Infernoble, I know a lot of people played against this deck before, and the boards were kind of crazy. But what was really funny is that back when Auroradon was legal, if you impermed Auroradon, they literally passed. And it was crazy. And you can see that in my old hand trap guides where I was talking about that. And then people were like, oh my god, if I hand trap this one card, they literally lose. And that's exactly how the format went. But I do think that it's a problem now. That there's a couple different things you have to really keep in mind. One is that now there's a really good Ash target, and that's going to be the Museum. So the Museum's second effect is still a card that I have to get ruled because it says that you can activate the second effect if the first effect was applied, but if you negate the first effect with Ash, then you're negating the effect, and technically the effect wasn't applied because the effect was negated. But I was also being told that you didn't negate the activation, so the effect was still applied, but you also negated the effect. So I don't know how that's going to be ruled. It's definitely going to be an interesting one, and that's going to be one for like the head judge of the first event that we go to. But ashing the first effect, the Museum, is always going to be really correct. I think that's still really solid. If your opponent opens up with like Durendal, then it's not a problem to go ahead and just ash that either. Or of course, if you have like 2 hand traps and the normal summon connector, you might have to just go ahead and hand trap the connector. But that's why there's multiple cards here for like your effect negation. Because if you have like Isolde, you're definitely going to go ahead and just negate that and hope they don't have like another one. Usually they're only going to send like 1 equip spell, maybe 2. They really want to go ahead and just summon the Renaud from deck, which is really solid. If your opponent opens up with like Renaud and have like equip spells in the graveyard, this is another card that you just want to go ahead and negate. So it's realistically like Connector first. If you see it, you have to negate this card. If you have Imperm, then you're just not using it on Connector, I don't think, because at that point you can just use that on Isolde, and Dolphin can't rip Imperm, so you force them to have to like make an awkward play. So Imperm on Connector, never correct. But if you have any of these on Isolde, if they don't have Connector, you're dropping any of these on Isolde. If they take like a weird route and they don't have like a direct line to their actual play they want to do, you could always hand trap Renaud, and that's usually very effective. But always go ahead and just make sure that you're ashing the Museum. If they start off with a Durendal, I'd probably be more inclined to go ahead and just ash the Durendal anyway, though. So for the next deck here, we have Altergeist. So Altergeist is definitely just cope. I don't like this deck at all. I think that you're just adding a lot of really weird variants to the deck with a lot of the new cards, because now the deck can get nibbed, and like that's never been a problem for this deck. So I don't really think that you should be adding in a lot of cards that just like ruin what the deck wants to do, because like we already have 3 metaverse and whatnot. I'd probably just be playing Geist with like 3 metaverse and like Secret Village, you know. So I don't really think that you should be adding in a ton of combo cards that just make your deck lose to things that it literally shouldn't lose to. But if you do play against this deck, using Bell against Manifestation is going to be really solid. Again, the whole Silcoius loop with that card too is kind of annoying, but at the same time, they don't get to bring back valuable resources. Using Veiler or Imperm on Marionetta is always going to be really solid too. I like to play a lot just because you cut off things like Manifestation or Protocol, and you really don't want Protocol to hit the board. That's really annoying to deal with. Now, for Ash, if your opponent goes normal Meluseek, Link Kuriboh, and then they go Effect, I'm probably just ashing that. But if they don't open Meluseek and they just have like Marionetta, I'm probably just saving the Ash for spoofing, because if we all remember how spoofing works, spoofing's cost. So when your opponent goes effective spoofing, say cost, let them shuffle what they're going to shuffle, then Ash. It's the same thing as like Ogre. They lose so much value if you do this. It's kind of crazy. So that's something to really keep in mind. And then if your opponent like is actually able to summon the multi-faker, then you can Ash. I think this is like the weakest Ash, because if your opponent has Protocol, then it literally never mattered. So I'm always trying to hit the cards that are going to be like immediate, where Protocol shouldn't be a problem. Like normal summon Meluseek on turn 0 is always going to be the best thing to Ash at that point, because there's no like, what if they have Protocol, because they don't have it yet. And also if they use spoofing, I'm just going to hope they don't have Protocol, because it's still one of the best spots to hit. So kind of keep that in mind when you're playing, that Protocol is a card and it could be set. But these are very effective places to hit. Ashing Multi-Faker is still really weak, but it could be alright. So the next one here is Exosister. So this deck has been doing really well, and rightfully so. The deck has a lot of very cool utility. Also can run D-Shifter, so you already know how that goes. Pretty crazy. I really want to see that card banned. It's really unhealthy. If your opponent has Magnifica, it's definitely correct to go ahead and just hold the Imperm and Imperm the Magnifica when you can on your turn, because at that point you just force the interruption out. Your opponent has to like swap out for the Martha. So that's something where you can at least deal with a lot less issues. The other thing too is if your opponent summons a Caspatel to go into searching for like Martha or their extender, then you want to go ahead and just Veiler the Caspatel. And then you're almost always ashing Martha. Like you're almost always just going to go ahead and throw Ash on Martha. But if your opponent has Vadis and they don't open Martha, just know if they set like 2 cards, one's probably Vadis. So you want to go ahead and ash that instead if they don't open the Martha, of course. If you open up like Veiler Ash, they go Caspatel, you Veiler it, they set 1 and pass, they probably have Vadis, and you can just like ash that instead. These are the things that you have to be able to read, right? So if your opponent has 2 set cards and they're playing Sword Soul, you'd almost always assume, especially if it's post side, that one is Blackout and the other one is probably Anti-Spell. If you make it to the main phase with no flip, then it's probably Imperm or a Circle. It's the same thing against Exosister, where if they have 2 set, one's Returnia, one's Vadis. Or like one's Returnia, one's Imperm. I think that Returnia is the card that is prioritized. But at the same time, like when you're playing against a lot of these decks and you have different hand traps that you really want to make the most out of, these are the reads that you have to be able to make. And I think that that's another video that I'll make as far as like different assumptions that you can have during duels to help you win. Because you'll see me do this on stream all the time. And if you haven't already checked my stream, down in the description below, these are the ways that you can really get an edge on your opponent, where you can kind of like predict what is going to happen before it happens. And I talk about this a lot whenever you're in a really grindy game state. If you're playing against a deck like Sword Soul, I use this because it's like the most streamlined deck out there. If your opponent has 6 cards left in their extra deck and you have a full reel of what's in their graveyard, right? So you can see like they have a Chisha engraved, they have a Baron engraved, and then you're like, what are the last 6 cards in their extra deck? And you see like 2 monks in the graveyard. You're like, all right, one's a monk, one's a shaman. They haven't used Changing or Sinister yet, so that's 4 cards. Maybe you haven't seen Dragite yet. Dragite is like sometimes they use it, sometimes they don't. Maybe you haven't seen Berserker yet, so that's like 5. These are like the things you have to think about so you know how impactful your hand trap's going to be against certain cards. Because if they use a card that could be impactful, but you know they don't have much left in their extra deck, you let it go. And the next thing that they were trying to like get you to hand trap the first thing, when you hand trap the second thing, it's way more impactful. So that's something that you really got to think about when you're playing. So the next thing here is Runick Fur Hire. So Runick Fur Hire is a really crazy deck that we've been seeing a lot of now, but I still think that it's fairly easy to beat. If you're going against a deck and you have Bell, you're just going to Bell Donner absolutely 100% of the time. If you have any kind of effect negation, you're just going to go ahead and drop it on Donner immediately. This is just going to be like one of the biggest choke points of the deck. But the other huge choke point is honestly just using Ash against Rookie. Rookie is very important to be able to summon Beat. And this is something where you'll see a lot of people using like the Rookie to tag out their Hugin if it gets like negated by an Imperm or a Veiler. If they have it, usually Rookie is like a one of. But I almost never hand trap the Rex with like a straight up effect negation, because at that point I'm like, they could be searching for something like Mayhem, or they could already have like a Rookie. I would just wait for the Rookie because I think that it's just the most impactful spot. But you're always going to go ahead and just hand trap Donner, Ash the Rookie, and then if your opponent has a Rex in the graveyard that try to use the effect, you can either Bell the effect of Rex in the graveyard, or you can just Crow the target. And I think that's equally important, because if your opponent has Fogo and Donpa, you don't want them to be able to summon another Fur Hire to be able to trigger the Donpa to pop something to then go ahead and draw 3 more cards. And usually it's I think it's a level 7 or 8 that allows you to like prosperity with how many Fur Hires are on your board is what gets summoned. So this is definitely going to be a really solid way to go ahead and hand trap this deck to make sure that they can't get a ton of card advantage over you. Next up is Unchained Labrynth. Now this deck caught me by surprise, because I did not think that it would actually be as good as it is. And I'm very glad that it is, honestly. I think the deck is very based. I think the new Unchained monsters are essentially Fire and Ice Hand, and I think that's also very cool. But there are a lot of different ways you want to go ahead and hand trap this deck particularly. There are ways I'll show you to hand trap Unchained and Labrynth separately, but at the same time, I think that there's quite a few ways that you can really efficiently hand trap this deck to really get the edge in your favor. So whenever you're playing against this, the link to Yama, Mourner, Veiler, definitely going to go ahead and just drop it on Yama to make sure that they can't get more advantage, they don't get the free Rhoda. That's definitely going to be really important. There's a couple decks that you'll see on here that I'm saying hold the Imperm for your turn because it's just important. If you're playing against a deck like this, just hold Imperm as long as possible, because they do put up Wave High King Caesar, and that card is insane. So that's a card where you really want to make sure that you're holding the Imperm for your turn, because this card's not once per turn. Like, they can use it twice. So if you hold the Imperm and then hit it, at least you can play the game. So that's something where I would say hold the Imperm, but if you have Mourner or Veiler, definitely go after Yama. And then, of course, Bell on Big Welcome. Or you can Ash it if you don't feel like they have Welcome. But I'm probably just going to go ahead and Ash if I only have one hand trap. Because if I have Bell and Ash, then of course I'm just going to like Bell Big Welcome. But if I only have Ash, I'm just going to Ash the first Welcome that I see, right? But then Ash on Welcome as well is still going to be really impactful. I think the deck together is really cool. You also can hold the Imperm if your opponent doesn't get to like the Caesar and they put up the Unchained Link 2, the one that allows you to like link with your opponent's monster. You can also just Imperm that. But against this and the Unchained deck by itself, you're always holding Imperm for your turn, because they always put up like some kind of crazy interruption, and you want to make sure that you have the negation for it. Talking about Labrynth alone, we really don't have to talk about this, but I wanted to make sure that I brought it up again just so everyone knows that nothing really changed. Veiler Imperm on Ariana, and then Bell on Big Welcome, and then Ash on Welcome. Again, not much to say here. But Unchained, again, you want to hold the Imperm for Rage. This is still just correct. Again, you want to make sure that you don't get caught off guard by anything super crazy. If you have multiple hand traps, though, you want to make sure that you're using Veiler, especially since it's only on their turn, on Yama. If you want to use it on Sarama because they're going to reset like the chamber, then you can. That's totally fine. But Veiler or Imperm on either of these is perfectly fine too. Bell on Chamber for when it's trying to reborn from the hand or grave. Of course, you don't really have a guarantee. There's nothing being engraved by the time it resolves, so you can go ahead and Bell Chamber. You also can Ash Chamber if they go like Aruha and pop it. So that's something to also think about, because that's just going to be a free summon from deck for something that they really need. Even if it's like Sarama, it's probably just Sarama at that point, because then they can just go into Yama. So maybe you Ash the Chamber is still fine, but I'm probably always just waiting for like Prison to go ahead and Ash, just because this card is just a generic Rhoda for the deck. So that's something where you really want to make sure that you have the stop to that. But whichever of these I see first, I'm just going to go ahead and Ash that. But Bell on the Chamber is fine. Bell is still in everyone's side deck at 3. It's still a really solid card right now. Negation on the Yama or the Sarama, and then holding the Imperm for your turn, of course. Dragon, this is another situation where if you do not have an out for Borland in your deck, you are holding Imperm the entire time. You can Imperm something like a Safer if you want. But even holding Imperm for like a Heretic Seal, totally fine. I don't feel like there's enough that Dragon does that scares me for them putting up an end board, because usually it's like Beast Seal or like Borland Savage. And if I'm like baiting the effect of like the Savage, it's a little unfortunate if I have to like put something on board, because at that point I can't like Imperm. But if it's just Borland, sometimes it happens. I've seen it happen multiple times. I'm just holding the Imperm, because this is something that actually made me lose at Nationals, is like I couldn't out a Borland. So just having Imperm for your turn is really important. Unless you have other ways in your deck, like you're playing Striker or whatever, right? That you can just outright out a Borland, it doesn't matter. That's one thing. But if you can't, definitely want to make sure you're holding the Imperm. Especially against like a Heretic Seal, it's still really solid to hold the Imperm for that too. Using Bell on any of the Bishtuls, if they try to summon like the Saronir or like a Magnemite, really solid Bell target. Sometimes if they summon like a Druid's Worm and you're confident that you don't really care if it's on the field, if you can like banish it or something, sometimes that's fine to let through. But like the Saronir or the Magnemite, usually you want to go ahead and make sure that you're going to go ahead and Bell the summon of it, just so they can't get further. Then you can also Bell the add back from Safer, which is really impactful, so your opponent can't get to things like Levianeer. That's a card that you really don't want to see summoned on you. The next thing here is going to be Valor Imperm onto the Lubellians, so they can't get to things like a Regained or a Beast. But you also can go ahead and negate the Romulus, so they can't get to Ravine. Ravine is a really key piece for the combo, so you can get the cards like Lubellian. Usually it's like dump Saronir and then dump Lubellian, so you have more cards engraved for things like the Levianeer. So something that you really just want to think about. Either of these cards are really solid to go ahead and negate. I really like negating the Lubellian just because Regained is a really crazy card. Ash on Chaos Base has always been a really rough time, because you don't know if your opponent's going to have Gamma. But this is now more free than it's ever been, because Gamma's at 1. You will still see Gamma run around some lists, which is really interesting. But Ash and Chaos Base is like the #1 Ash spot you'll always do. But if your opponent ever opens up by going like Ravine pitch, especially if it's not Abzerot they're pitching, you're probably always just going to go ahead and Ash the Ravine, because that's super free value right there. But at the same time, you kind of have to like wait to see what your opponent's doing, right? Because if your opponent goes like Ravine pitch Abs, I might not Ash that, because at that point like they're already getting advantage. But it really depends on the situation you're at, what your hand looks like, and how much you think you can deal with. So it's really going to be a judgment call at that point. So next up here is Mannadome. This is going to be another situation where if you can't out a Chaos Angel, maybe you want to hold the Imperm for it. But otherwise, Mannadome is a really weird deck as far as hand trapping, because the deck has a really bad problem with spot removal. Like, I was playing Math Mech, I remember, against Mannadome back at the YCS, and it was very apparent to me that if you go Laplacian, send the normal summon, the deck just folds. So the deck isn't like super strong, and again, nothing really changed with the new cards that came out. You're still just ashing Calarium and negating the Realm Heart. So it's really interesting to see, because like you could always wait for like the Vasas Synchro to come out and like negate that too. But there's a lot of situations where like your opponent also really wants to add off the Realm Heart. So that's something where I would just go ahead and ash the Calarium and then just negate Realm Heart. I don't think much changes off that though. I hope that everyone enjoyed today's video. There's a lot of information there, so I really do appreciate each and every one of you. A lot of the information that I have really takes me a while to gather. So whether or not I'm spending my day at work and then coming home and sitting on DB, or watching a ton of YouTube videos and just trying to see like what all the different variants the different decks are doing, or even just like playing at locals or bigger tournaments. I really want to make sure this information is as accurate as possible for you. So I really do hope that you can use this information and do really well with it. I appreciate each and every one of you for that. If you haven't already checked out my Discord, Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, or my Metafy page, definitely go ahead and do so, all down below in the description. We are on our way to 20,000 subscribers. When we hit 19,000, it's going to be really exciting because I'll announce a 20K giveaway. So I really want to see each and every one of you there. It's going to be a really exciting time. I appreciate you guys. I hope everyone has a wonderful night. I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you.